Hello and welcome to another glorious episode of Pod of the Gaps. I am Aaron Edwards and I have with me Michael Otts and Andy Bannister, whose names should be nameless. No, they shouldn't be nameless. They should remain nameless because they're so famous. They are Christian celebrities, clearly, or especially as a result of this podcast. I'm sure they will be. How are you guys doing this week, Michael? I noticed you've been. We talked a lot about your baking habits last week, and we've got another update on this, haven't we? You're eating something quite interesting.
Well, I've just literally finished, but so I made pork pies a couple of days ago, and basically I've got so bored in lockdown. I'm now kind of taking random things that you would normally just buy and never think of making, and trying to work out how you make it. And actually, I was pleasantly surprised. It kind of like tasted like a pork pie, which is pretty good.
There you go.
So from is that from baking habits to bacon habits? Is there a kind of link?
Look at that.
That's awful.
Look at that. but the listeners they'd think this wasn't a Pod of the Gaps if there wasn't a bad pun from the Bannister machine.
Especially for me. And it is interesting, isn't it? The stuff you do during lockdown, because Michael's been doing the baking, and then for us, well, for me, it's getting into doing my own firewood, because we put a wood burning stove in about 18 months ago. We used to just be very lazy and buy the wood, but in lockdown, I was like, no, I'm going to manfully go out and win back heating for my family from the elements, and I've got into saws and axes and all kinds of paraphernalia, and now so quite proud that I have a garage full of my own chopped wood. I mean, I've slaughtered a pig. So sorry for any vegetarians listening, but I have chopped my own wood.
There you go. Yeah, well, clearly you guys just don't have enough children, because I don't have time over lockdown to with 5 little ones. I don't have time to invent new baking skills. Sadly,
you're just bringing up children. That's quite enough.
That's the thing. But we did actually find someone was emptying a skip yesterday, which was like the event of the year. Not emptying; they were filling a skip. Emptying would be weird. We'd be at the dump, wouldn't we? They were filling up a skip, and there was all sorts of crazy stuff in there. There was like full-on Bosch drills, like power tool drills, which I don't really know how to use. But I thought these will come in handy. Why are they getting rid of all this amazing stuff? So we were all kind of leaning in, and my children were helping me get things out. And then Molly was looking down over the skip from our flat above and going, "Is that a tea set in there?" And we're like, I think so. Most of it smashed, but we tried to recover. So we ended up recovering, in the end, a significant 1950s tea set, which was then, spent the rest of the afternoon washing up and getting ready, which was quite.
So good. This is not so much part of the gaps as Sting of the Dump, to use a literary reference that probably no one who grew up. If you grew up in England in a certain time, you would know that book. But there we go.
Okay. And speaking indeed of Pod of the Gaps, it's interesting. This is our 8th show, is it?
It is our 8th show. And the banter is still bantering.
But the Bannister's certainly still bantering his way down the Bannister. And I noticed something interesting, actually, as I was looking for this. We started off saying we're going to go for sort of like 20 to 30 minutes, nice and snappy. Our first episode came in at 32 minutes. Second episode, 34 minutes. Episode 3, 37 minutes. Episode 4, 43 minutes. Episode 5, 47 minutes. Episode 6, 51 minutes. I don't know what episode 7 was. I think it was 52. So are we going to reach our limit? Are we going to get to 53 minutes, or are we going to go lower? Let's see what we can manage. All of this.
Imagine what's going to happen in a year's time if we're still going.
At this rate, yeah. I'm remembering that. Yeah, exactly.
Welcome to the Church Dogmatics podcast.
The first ever 24-hour podcast. We'll get into a record. That'll be fun. Anyway, so without further ado, in case we do actually hit the 60-minute barrier, we should get onto our topic for today, which is about reading, about why reading matters. What is the deal with reading? Why is it a big deal? Why is it an important thing to do? I've noticed that obviously we are in a very literate culture in the West today, especially so. People are reading more than ever to some extent, and others would say they're reading less than ever. To another extent, so there's a lot of text out there. There's a lot of literary sources out there, often online, and reading habits have changed, haven't they? We do live in this kind of daily pressure of needing to feel the need to read, and some people perhaps don't read enough, whereas perhaps some are stressed about what they should be reading and aren't quite sure, need some guidance. So, given as you two are both very well-read people. Especially, is this a mean thing to say? You're very well-read for evangelists. Because some might say there's another generation of evangelists which might have gone, well, I don't need to read as much. I just need to focus on getting the story out there. I know all I need to know, and I'll pick up a bit on the way, but I don't need to. But you both actually make you're very great examples of people who read very widely. I'm not just looking at Michael's shelf behind him and seeing. Actually,
mainly the Lonely Planet guides actually in the view behind me.
I can see the ESV Study Bible. That's good. And I can see the Harry Potter series with the ever expansive spines for every later edition. She's ended up having no editorial help really to cut it down. And then you've got a lot of travel guides, which that speaks for itself for your globe-trotting.
Barbados, Antigua, Canada, those kind of things. And I must say, just to return the compliment, Aaron, you are remarkably communicative for a theologian. Most theologians I know speak in grunts and in Latin, and can hardly make themselves understood. But you use like normal words, what ordinary people can understand.
No, thank you so much. Well, it could be that I'm a communicable theologian, or I'm just a bad theologian who hasn't learned enough. Or
you sound like a disease, actually. Yeah. I think communicable is diseases. Communicative is the word you wanted. A communicable theologian.
That's true. Yes.
How ironic.
That's right. Excellent. So anyway, let's get going on this. So you're both well read. You've both been talking about the ways in the previous episodes, things you've been reading, and why you've been reading. So let's talk about why do you read? Why does reading matter? And how does it work for you? What have you been reading lately? Michael, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting you mentioned that, Aaron, in terms of, you're well read for evangelists. I know you were kind of slightly doing it in jest and slightly doing it seriously. And actually, for me, particularly a number of years ago when I was kind of looking at evangelists, I often felt that you had this kind of like dichotomy in the Christian world between kind of theologians and academics who were incredibly well read and very cerebral, but were just a bit dull and maybe lacking passion to try and communicate the gospel. And then you have people who were really fiery evangelists who were keen to challenge people to repent and believe, but actually maybe the depth of their message wasn't that great, and it was basically the same sermon regurgitated over and over again. Very good sermon, but it was the same one they preached 10 years ago and that kind of thing. And for me, really the mentor and kind of model that really challenged me was working with Michael Green, who was both an evangelist and a theologian. We spent about 10 years doing missions together, and one of the things I noticed about Michael is he had that fiery edge of an evangelist who, he always used to say, I want to electrify the fence upon which people sit. He wanted to challenge people to respond. But he was also a theologian who was incredibly well read, who could give, very thought through answers to questions and so on. And so really it was his example that was a model to me and a challenge to me. And I was also particularly challenged. He was in his 80s throughout the time I knew him, basically. And yet whenever I would use a quote that he hadn't heard, he would always want to know what book it came from, particularly if it was a contemporary book that he hadn't yet read. And he would go, so I need to go and read that because there'll be a good quote in that for me. And so his example of continual reading, even into his 80s, and holding together, deep reading with a clear heart for the lost and a desire to communicate the gospel, I think for me was probably one of the biggest influences in my life.
That's really fascinating. What you say the kind of tutelage you had there from Michael Green is wonderful. And if you had a similar kind of experience, did you have someone guiding you in reading habits along the way?
Yeah, I think in my case, I grew up in a house surrounded by books. My father particularly is he's still with us, was a great reader. So there was something was magical as a child of going into he hadn't got a study, we hadn't got a house big enough for that, but like every room had a bookshelf in it, and I just used to find that fascinating, just yanking stuff off the shelf before I was old enough to appreciate it, everything from history to biography to theology. So I caught that love of reading early. And I suppose why I read now, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think, firstly, I love the interior space for reflection. We live in a very noisy kind of world. And a lot of those spaces that we try and process in, it's hard because it's distraction. So if you try to read online, for example, try to read a newspaper online, there's always adverts and whatnot. Read on your phone, it's always pinging and buzzing. But there is something about, like at our house, we have a digital-free Sunday. We turn our phones off. And so yesterday afternoon, it's a Monday, we're recording this. The kids went out to play with their neighborhood friends outside. My wife and I lit the wood-burning stove, kind of sat there and just read for 90 minutes. And just to be able to just get some headspace to be just you and the voice of the author is quite special in today's world. So I love that interior space for reflection. And then the other reason I suppose I love reading is I think I probably am wired to be insatiably curious. I've always been curious. I love knowing things, finding things out, whether it's talking to people or reading. And one of my sort of literary heroes is a guy called F.W. Boreham, not known by many, but probably is actually arguably Australia's most prolific writer. He was a Baptist minister, went down from England to accept a pastorate in New Zealand at first in 1895, and then moved on to Australia and wrote, I think, about 55 books in his life, and many of them have gone into multiple editions. And he wrote these little essays where he takes something from life and then reflects on it and land it on an aspect of the Christian faith. And I don't know anyone who can illustrate as well, but he wrote a wonderful little essay, which for me sums up why I read. It's called Slice of Infinity. And he talks about the fact that, firstly, when you sample life, sample infinity. Don't just read about one thing. Don't just read one part of the Bible, but sample infinity. But then he connects it to evangelism. He said, if you're sitting in his illustration, I think he used, you're sitting in a train carriage or on an aeroplane, or, you're walking down the street, get talking to somebody, and it turns out, they're into, angling or something, isn't it? Aren't you grateful that you read Fly Fishing by J.R. Hartley the other year? Because, you found that in a secondhand bookshop. And the more you read, and the wider you sample infinity, it gives connections to people. So I love reading because I find stuff out. I love reading because then when I talk to different people. And I think the other question you asked, what I'm reading right now, I'm very eclectic. So literally right now I'm reading F.W. Boreham's book, A Late Lark Singing from 1946. I am reading The Book That Made Your World by Vishal Mangalwadi, really fascinating book on the legacy of the Bible. I'm reading The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. That's my kind of evening kind of fireside reading. I go through that every 5 years. And then, you want eclectic, I'm reading Norwegian Wood, Chopping, Stacking and Drying Wood, the Scandinavian World by Lars Mitting, which is an amazing book on how you chop wood, how to choose your axe, what kind of soil you want, how to build your wood piles, and kind of things. So I said during lockdown, I've got into wood. This thing sold about 1.5 million copies. It's absolute. It's like the detail is amazing. But the stuff I've learnt, I now know what axe I need if I'm going to chop wood or dispose of a body.
There we go. Well, so we heard it here first. Yeah.
And just on what you were saying, Andy, on that, one of the things I found really helpful, we mentioned the shallows, or the swallows, I think, as Aaron called it.
By Nicholas Carr.
Yeah. But by Nicholas Carr. But one of the things he says is that actually our brains are only designed to be able to process about 2 or 3 things. We have a short-term memory, which is, remembering what we've just done the second before, and our long-term memory is like the difference between, the RAM and the hard disk on a computer. He says if things are going to go into our long-term memory, we can't process more than about 2 or 3 things at once. And if we don't process it, it'll never go into our long-term memory. He says the problem with people reading kind of tweets and articles online is that generally you're kind of scanning through lots of stuff. It's in your short-term memory, but it never goes and processes into the long-term memory. You don't really remember what you read on Twitter yesterday, although you were kind of engaged with it at the time. Whereas when you take the time to go through a book, you're actually processing that so that you can recall it later. And so I think I found, just mentally, it's actually a really helpful thing to slow yourself down, read a book, be forced to think about one thing for an extended period of time. And actually that's helpful, not just at the time, but also long term. And you also mentioned about different types of reading. I think, sorry, Andy's trying to distract us for the listener by showing us pictures of wood, which is very exciting. But kind of what I was going to say on that was actually one of the things I learned early on, which is really helpful with reading, is that there are different types of books for different types of times of day. So I have books that I'm reading for my work that I've just been writing a book, and so there's been various books that I've been reading in preparation for that. I kind of read them during the day, but at bedtime at the moment I'm reading through Lord of the Rings again. So they're kind of like the books that you read kind of like to relax, the books that you read when you need to have a bit more energy. I think early on what I discovered as a Christian is I was trying to read like weighty theological tomes at bedtime and like falling asleep, and thinking actually no, there's certain books that are kind of easier to read than others. Some are good for dipping into for half an hour once a day, and some are good for just losing yourself in for an afternoon.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
That's good.
It's interesting what you say. We'll come back to the how we read a bit later on, but it's interesting what you say even just briefly on the online reading thing, because it is, right now, if I could give you a screen share, the amount of tabs I tend to have running at any given time, and you open new tab was a beautiful invention, but in a way it's caused a lot of stress, hasn't it? Because you end up having so many things. I really want to. That's a long read. I must get to that at some point, and sometimes you end up feeling a kind of joy at like getting through a tab or through the tabs, but you haven't actually taken in what you've read. But you feel like I've ticked it off, I have read it. Have you read it? I definitely read it. I don't think you've actually read it. You've read it, but you haven't really taken it in. You've been thinking about the next tab. So there's a real danger there, isn't there, on how they're going. But I just want to jump, before we move on to this sort of hows a bit more, staying on this sort of why question. Andy mentioned something about curiosity and in generality. You've both given examples there for what you're reading widely and reading very generally. I heard something recently, which I think I sent to you both earlier in the week, or last week was it, around an interesting conversation between C.R. Wiley and Doug Wilson on specialization, over specialization in education. So nowadays you get specialists who over specialize, or uber specialize, PhDs on the tiniest fragment of a certain source of knowledge within a field. So it really, someone who gets a PhD may not actually be a fully competent in the entirety of their field now, whereas it used to be the case that you needed to have that and you specialize. Now we just created more subcategories, so that even the experts don't really know much very broadly beyond what they seem to know, even if they're doctors in a subject. So it's a huge thing, isn't it, to think the separate, I think the conversation I heard that I mentioned just there was specialization is for insects. That there's something about an insect like in an ant colony, they know how to do a certain job, and they know I can do this, but I don't know how it fits into the whole. As human beings, we have curiosity as a God-given trait to some extent. So our ability to read generally and connect things to the whole is a huge part of what it means to be a human being. Reading widely, not just going, I'm reading pragmatically because this is what I'll end up using. So maybe, Michael and I might not be in a wood chopping phase, but Andy might recommend us the wood chopping book for its other qualities. So there's things you can learn that are just interesting. It's good to be curious in the good ways. There's obviously bad kinds of curiosity as well, which I won't get into. Medieval theology tended to look at curiosity as a negative thing, because it meant you were never focused on what you're supposed to be focused on. And there's some value to that, because we have a bit of the bad kind of curiosity in our age, don't we? Online tabbing, for example, is an example. I'm curious about 1,000 things. I'm not then going to drill down into anything in particular. But I think you're saying something different, aren't you, there? Yeah, Michael.
I think so.
No, just to say on that, I can't remember who it was who said it, but something I found really helpful. They said, everything about something and something about everything. So there is a kind of, we all have our specialist areas, and I guess if you're working in a particular field that requires study, you will be forced to study to a degree that others won't. But that sense of but also just try and get to know something about lots of different areas of life as well, which just makes us very interesting to talk to, hopefully, because I found as an evangelist, when you're chatting to people, if you've read widely, there's a point of connection that you can have with all sorts of people.
Yeah.
And if you find that you're talking to someone who's got an interest in something you've never heard about, find out about it. And that's often inspired me to then go away and find out more about that particular area.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andy.
I think the other thing as well, as to add to the specialization piece, Aaron, that I think you're definitely onto something. I remember somebody once describing to me that the best way to think of a PhD is specialized ignorance. That people who haven't got a PhD are ignorant about ordinary things, but people who've got doctorates are just have ignorance in specialized areas. And there's definitely something in that. But the interesting thing is how actually the world that we live in does encourage us not to read widely. So I mean, the one example of this would be algorithms. You go to Amazon, and based upon, say, and other online booksellers are available, but let's say you go to Amazon, and based upon your previous purchasing history, it recommends 3 or 4 things that you might like. Yeah. And if you're not careful, you go, "Oh, that's interesting," and suddenly you just find yourself, reading in one particular area. And I think the challenge is how, as you say, without becoming, sort of dilettantes or being distracted and with a mind that flits everywhere like some rare type of butterfly, how do you actually have an interest in things? And one thing I'll often say to people, because people often ask, for advice on what to read, and I think certainly in terms of making connections, one thing I'll often say to folk is, well, look around you, look around your culture, look around the type of people that you're with, look around the part of the country you're in, the time that you're in. What are some of the issues? And read some stuff, at least gently, that helps you think about that. You don't need to be an apologist or a theologian to realize, say, that the transgender issue, which is currently tearing our culture in all kinds of directions. If you're going to be a Christian who wants to connect to people, to have read just 1 or 2 things on that, so you can speak in an informed way, you could say, and actually I found this with people, if you open a conversation by saying, it's interesting, I was reading something on this the other day that made me think, that has slightly more credibility than, well, you know what, it's often occurred to me that. And so I think, again, books can, give you a connection point. They can also give you a bit of a cover because it's this particular author rather than yourself. And again, they can help us engage with some of the big questions of our age too.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, Andy, because I don't think you'd know, but actually most of the books I've been reading the last couple of weeks have all been on the issue of transgender. So
is there something you need to tell us, Michael? Is there a sort of
so, but I guess for that very reason, that like actually this is a huge issue. So so I'm reading, not specifically on it, but Paula Gooder's book Body, which is kind of looking more at the theology of the body and why the body is important, which was recommended, which was really helpful. Preston Sprinkle's book Embodied, which came out this year, which specifically on the issue of transgender, which was really helpful. And then Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Although, having listened to his podcast and seen the length of the book, I'm not sure whether I'm going to get through the whole thing. Sometimes I kind of think, like, I guess there's always like a kind of investment in time, isn't there, in terms of like the length of the book. And it's like, someone once said to me, the true cost of a book is not the money you spend buying it, it's the time you spend reading it. So there is always that evaluation of, we can't read everything, so we have to choose wisely.
Interesting. There's a famous quote from Arthur Schopenhauer. He said, to buy books would be a wonderful thing if only we could also buy the time to read them.
Yes.
And he's saying that in the mid-19th century or early to mid-19th century.
Yeah.
And you think how many books have been in the UK, they say 188,000 books are published every year in the UK alone. How that's just absurd. And you compare that to, in the 19th century, there were already an insurmountable amount of books that one was stressed about wanting to try and read. And they're probably harder to read, many of them, than some of the books that are overly specialised. They're not connected to the general themes today. So we do get a sense of being, drowning under the weight, and you have to make those choices, don't you? As Michael says about time investment. What is going to be the most beneficial thing out of this book? Is Andy going to read 3 books on wood shopping, or is the one book on wood shopping enough? But that's you've got to make those choices all the time. Haven't we?
Well, the next thing, of course, will be during lockdown with kind of, do-it-yourself lockdown stuff is Michael or I or Aaron, one of us needs to decide we'll try and actually make our own book. I can chop the wood, Michael can process it into paper, and Aaron, you can write words of 4 syllables. One thing I want to say, actually, is that it's interesting you mentioned the word investment there occurred to me because, of course, books are not cheap. And it's worth being aware of that. For some people listening to this podcast, it may be a problem. Others, it may be more of a sacrifice. And, it's interesting. To return, just because he's on my mind because I've been reading him a bit recently. It was interesting, Borum, I remember being quite struck at his biography that as a young pastor, when money was really tight, he decided he would make the commitment to buy and read 1 book a week. And he carried that through for the whole of his life. And so he said early on, it was a sacrifice. It was tough to do that. But the foundation it laid, and there is something about the investment, okay, so now, I'm middle class. Buying a book is not tough as it once was when I was a student, but there's still something about thinking about, okay, I've got 10 quid here. I could spend that on Starbucks. I could pay off a bit of the credit card. I could do other things with it, or I could buy a book. And then I want to think a bit more carefully because, okay, what
you
book
couldn't
do I
buy
want
one
to
of
set
my
my
books.
shelves?
They're academic. You couldn't buy an academic.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, but they do burn really well. Actually, almost as good as a log if you chop them up. Kind of thing. So I think it's the book's investment, and that becomes interesting about thinking about, okay, what do I want on my shelves? And actually, one of the things I love about reading, actually, I love looking around my shelves, which are all triple stacked now. And there's something. This is kind of weird. Perhaps people who are not book lovers listening to this will think Bannister's gone bonkers, but there's something about the sort of sense of being surrounded by old friends.
Yeah,
I quite like. I can look up on the shelf, past my collection of empty gin bottles. There we go to shock all the Baptists listening. Go, oh yeah, look up there. I read that guy 2 years ago, and up there is John Lennox, and I remember when John wrote that, and over there is whatever. And there's something about being surrounded by that kind of circle of witnesses actually is quite interesting.
It's funny you use that phrase. My wife's grandfather, who died about a decade or so ago, we used to go and visit him when he was it must have been less than a decade ago. We used to go and visit him, and he basically couldn't move out of his chair in his lounge anymore, and he had carers coming in, and he was surrounded by books. He was an old science teacher, but he was a Methodist kind of local preacher and organist, and he read very widely. He had all of his books were kind of up to about the 1970s or 80s, but there's an insane eclectic mix, and we'd always come away and take 3 or 4 away with us, with his permission, of course. We weren't just kind of stealing from an old person who, in their chair. And he used to refer to them by the exact same name. These are my cloud of witnesses. They've kind of been with me over the years, and they've been sort of dialogue partners. And we don't often think of books like that. I heard, was it Eugene Peterson who said he would schedule time in his diary with an author, so that if someone came and said, someone's here to see you, Eugene. Oh no, he's in. His secretary would say he's in the office right now. He's got someone in the office with him, and in his diary it would say Dostoevsky or meeting with C.S. Lewis, and that's actually how he thought about reading. Because we often go, well, I'll read a book if I get time, but it's way more important to have this coffee with this person here, or this person respond to this problem. Well, maybe it is more helpful for you to have a conversation with C.S. Lewis. I mean, he can't answer back, but he said a lot of stuff in a lot of books. So you can actually have a pretty decent conversation, I would have thought, if you're actually reflecting as you're reading.
It's a lovely way of seeing it, actually, because we have access to the greatest minds of history at our fingertips, and like when we see it in that way, actually we're able to learn from people. And do we make the most? And I think also the other thing is when people are writing books, hopefully they're trying to you write kind of podcast, you can talk stuff in a podcast like this where we're kind of batting ideas back and forth. You might write a blog or something like that. But when you're writing a book, you're really trying to summarize the stuff that you've been really thinking about, chewing over, and then articulating it as well as you can, aren't you? It's hopefully the kind of epitome of your writing and thought processes. So when you're reading a book, you're actually getting access to the best of someone's thinking.
Absolutely.
In theory, at least, yeah.
And thinking about these voices from the past, as you say, you're getting access to them. As Andy said, he's got the cloud of witnesses on his shelves, looking down upon him, frowning or not. And so why is he chopping wood? He should be reading more books. But to what extent then is reading? Can reading change the world? To what extent can it really impact people in a really positive way for change, especially at an age where reading is under threat in all sorts of different ways? I mean, it's under threat for the digital age, as we've talked about already, in the sense of people's reading habits change or their brains are changing. But there's also a sense in which we've got cancel culture, haven't we? Coming in. I read something really interesting, an article on libraries in Syria. There's these revolutionary librarians in kind of war-torn Syria, and the sort of regime that has propagandized the nation, and there's kind of war-torn villages and towns. And there's this group of guys who found a kind of abandoned school, a school headmaster who'd fled the country or fled the city and abandoned everything. And he had a kind of room of books, and they found them, and they were kind of shaking with excitement at being able to recover these books that weren't allowed to be read. And so they set up this kind of underground library. And it's kind of amazing thing that they would then go to houses that were sort of abandoned or whatever and try and gather them. And it's all hush-hush, all underground. But it meant that reading itself was a political act. It was something that was able to, again, like we've said before, show that you're still alive, you're able to resist some of the ideologies. And we're in a culture now where, we're constantly saying, right, this author wasn't up to scratch as far as we now think in 2020, 2021, in terms of the way they phrase things, that they were of their time. Therefore, we think that they are racist or misogynist or whatever. So we're not allowed to read them. We'll take them off the curriculum. We'll stop printing new editions or whatever. So there's things like that which are genuinely, there are cultural elements of Western civilization which are dropping away, and that people are saying, don't read these. What do you think of that?
Well, I have to say, as you described that, Aaron, I love the idea of revolutionary librarians. I thought, that's a movie, man. That's a TV show. To go, wow. I mean, that makes me go, even the idea makes me go all dewy-eyed. Dewy library. It's just, okay. There'll be a few people who will think that joke is just phenomenal. Other people go, what the heck?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a generation, Andy. I think several generations' time when people are unearthing
that was actually very, very, very funny. But I do, of course, as Michael pointed out, I do save my funniest lines for my books when I write, not just on podcasts. I think there's a lot in there. Aaron, I mean, on the cancel thing, I find fascinating, because I think we talked about this on a previous show, actually, that there's something about books, certainly from the past, that should challenge us. They should make us uncomfortable. Sometimes they'll make us uncomfortable because we go, man, I'm not sure those guys had it right. Other times they'll challenge us because we haven't got it right. And in fact, one of the writers I like, who always challenges me, Douglas Murray. He's not a historic writer; he's a contemporary writer. He's a journalist. He's an atheist. He's gay, conservative politically. So in many ways, we don't line up on things. But he always writes consistently interesting books. And in one of his books, he talked about the fact, there was a book, right? It was an interview he was doing. That's right, an interview where he talked about. He said, we look back on previous cultures, and every other culture in the past, how great they were. We'll see things and we'll think, man, what were they thinking? They went mad at that point. He used the example of slavery. You look back at the early Victorians and stuff, and to go, they did so many things. Look at the advances in science and engineering and architecture, the stuff they were doing. But then slavery. And he goes, they were bonkers. They'd lost the plot at that point. And then he said, the thought occurs to you, what is the point in our culture at which 100 years, 200 years from now, people are going to look back and go, man, those men and women in the 21st century, just look what they had. They had all this technology and all this stuff. They were amazing. But at this point, they went mad. Now, Douglas thinks it's the transgender piece, that he thinks that in the future, people look back and go, they did what to kids? And I think reading from the past does that. And I think there's a side of maturity, actually, that you're able to read something from the past and go, I don't agree with it. But I don't have to agree with it. I could still go, man, I don't like that attitude. But on this other thing over here, I've got something to learn. And I think, of course, this gets into a much broader discussion around what is a great book or a piece of literature. I think it is something that stood the test of time. Something that was written 5 years ago hasn't stood the test of time. And it might still be helpful, but we need to remember it's more recent. So I think there's definitely that piece. And then in terms of books changing the world, which is how you led into the question, I think historically that's true. When you look historically, when literacy exploded, in the ancient world, when writing was developed sometime around about the second millennium BC at different points in different cultures, suddenly, here was the ability to pass on information and inform to the next generation that was more than just orality. Here was an idea, an ability for an author to reflect and edit their works. When you stand in front of an audience and speak extemporaneously, your words are done and they're out. But as an author, when you're writing, you can edit and you can shape and make it precisely what you want. And that idea, I think, we don't have to argue about it. It has changed the world. There are numerous books, whether it's politically, Thomas Paine or, John Stuart Mill or, other kind of things, whether it's the Bible and the impact that it's made, or whether it's other kind of books, think of Darwin's Origin of Species, whatever you think about particularly where that scientific theory has been unpacked, undoubtedly books have turned the world upside down. And thus, if nothing else, I think if we want to be well-rounded citizens, men and women who can engage with our culture as Christians, at least being aware of and having engaged with some of the books that have changed the world, and taking a stand against attempts to close reading and writing down and shut those down. Interesting, isn't it? In totalitarian societies, it's often the books that people come for. The Nazis burnt books, the communists have burnt books. I often say to more progressively minded friends over here, just be aware that book banning and book burning does not have a particularly good legacy. The sort of types of person that you are aligning yourself with, it's a bit of a rogues gallery, really.
Doesn't have a good CV.
Doesn't have a good
on
CV.
a practical note, is one of the concerns where people only source their books from Amazon. And I just think it's already happening with certain books, particularly any books that are going to touch on issues like transgender and so on, that from a Christian perspective that are going to be not available. So one of the reasons, among others, why I would personally try and use other sources if I can. But just on that, I think you mentioned at the beginning, Aaron, that in some ways people are reading more than they have, and other times they're reading less than they have, and that's one of the problems we're saying in our culture. I think as a Christian, and as a Christian who wants to try and communicate the gospel effectively to a world that needs Jesus, I think one of my responsibilities is to be able to understand the world so that I can communicate well to it. And obviously I'm a full-time evangelist in that sense, but in a sense all of us as Christians will want to hopefully have that concern to be able to communicate the gospel. And so one of our passions surely be to read and understand things so that we can connect, so we can build bridges for the gospel. And that means reading widely. So we've already talked about kind of reading kind of old and new, but I just jotted down a few other kind of different kind of things in terms of keeping our balance. So reading Christian and non-Christian. So I get frustrated as a Christian if an atheist has only ever read Dawkins, but equally an atheist could get frustrated with me if I'd have only read John Lennox. To give you one example. Politically, reading from the left and reading from the right, making sure that there's a breadth in our political perspectives. Agreeing with reading stuff that I agree with and disagree with. Sometimes it's really helpful to read a book that I profoundly disagree with on a topic that I care deeply about. It winds me up no end, and sometimes I found myself wanting to throw the book across the room. But actually, it's really helpful because it helps me to understand the best or the strongest argument coming again. So it helps me to think, how am I going to come back to that? And that often gets me thinking more than reading a Christian book, because I'm thinking, okay, well, how would I respond to that argument, and so on. And so on. And then a couple of other things, reading books by men and women, and reading books from people in my culture and people from outside my culture as well, I find is really helpful. And sometimes at the end of a year, I like to look back through my list of reading and just say, okay, what kind of balance, or where's the imbalance in my reading? What have I missed out on this year? And maybe correct that the following year.
That's really
on that note, actually.
I was
going to say on that note, Michael, an exercise that I was recommended onto about sort of 4 or 5 years ago, and has been really helpful, is that I never used to do this, but I now log everything I kind of read, just a little text file on the computer, and then firstly set myself a target. So I've got a certain number of books that I want to try and read this year. If I make it, great. If not, I don't beat myself up. But it's if you don't record it, you're never going to hit it. But then exactly as you said, you can look back at the end of the year and go, oh, okay, how is the mix here? Did I get a nice mix of different writers, different genders, different cultures, fiction, non-fiction, other things I wish I had read, well, in which case I could add them onto my wish list for next year. But just actually begin to be slightly more proactive in terms of tracking what you're doing. And if you don't, of course, the other thing, incidentally, a little plug there's a wonderful book website called goodreads.com. And that, if you want to be doing that as part of a community, that's fun, because you could join that, and it lets you share the books you've read. You become friends with others who are reading other kind of books. So that's a bit more social, or in my case, I just have a text file on the computer. It's encouraging, actually, because again, you can look back. It's great fun looking back. What did I read in 2018 and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's really good. Just a postscript on that before we move on to a couple of other things. You guys are both in positions of Christian leadership to some extent, in really actively involved in mission ministry. You're also well read, and you think about these things a lot. Now, there is a line of argument throughout the New Testament, which I think is important to say on the other side here about this wide reading thing. Paul regularly in his epistles talks about not engaging with certain figures, certain false teachers and leaders. So some Christians might hear what Michael was saying there about, not being embarrassed before the atheist when you haven't read enough of these texts. Where does it differ? What advice would you give to, let's say, people at a different stage of their faith journey or their theological journey, where they might say, actually, you need to not go near this one? Paul says in 2 Timothy, Hymenaeus and Philetus, their teaching is like gangrene. That doesn't mean critically engage with Hymenaeus and Philetus. Read all of their latest works so that actually you can really understand them. He said, no, look, just trust me. It's gangrenous. It's gonna cause problems. And now, to some extent, they are these are kind of people posing as Christians. It's slightly different to reading an atheist, I think. But where do you tend to give advice?
I think. Sorry, Michael.
If you both talk simultaneously, that'd be quite fun.
We can get first to like 54 minutes quicker, can't we? Or try and make it a shorter podcast. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, actually, because I was just reflecting on that and thinking, I guess partly, I wouldn't necessarily say to a new Christian, the first book you need to read is, this book by some, militant atheist. And if I am going to suggest reading that, I want to kind of talk about it and discuss it with people so that, we're kind of able to kind of work through that. So I'm not just kind of leaving that. But as you say, actually, in the Bible, some of these characters were people who were posing as Christians. They were false teachers. They weren't out and out enemies of the Christian faith. It's interesting because Paul, doesn't he, Acts 17 quotes, their poets. He's obviously widely read, but the people that he really seems to have anger and, real kind of ferocity against is people who are claiming to be Christian and yet teaching stuff that's otherwise. So actually, I was just thinking about that this weekend, talking to my wife, and was chatting to someone else recently who'd been reading a lot of stuff by kind of health, wealth, prosperity teachers. And just thinking, actually, I have no desire to read that whatsoever. It's helpful in a sense to know what the false teaching is, but I'm not going to sit and read Joel Osteen's latest book. I've got absolutely no time for that at all, because I just think, actually, here's someone who's claiming to present the gospel, but actually there's no gospel to it.
And just that's really helpful, Michael. And just to sort of take that before Andy jumps in on this, because Andy, can you? So Michael's mentioned, say, like a Joel Osteen, health, wealth, prosperity. Now in our culture,
he's got good teeth, though. I mean, it's good teeth.
He goes. He also travels a lot. I don't know how he gets that. Anyway, but that's an easier target. No one's going to have a go at Michael for saying, "Don't read Joel Osteen." Most evangelicals wouldn't. But there are increasing evangelicals who are reading a lot of more wokish Christianity type stuff, right? So at what point do you say, well, I better show that I'm not being, you both mentioned gender, for example. I must show there can be a danger we go, right, we must show that we're not in any way privileging men over women. So we must kind of overstep our mark. I must read all these books which sort of interpret my whiteness, my maleness, and all these power structures. That could also be perhaps more dangerous than reading some of the health people, presumably.
No, I think that's a very good point. I mean, just to sort of pick up on Michael's point, and then to answer that one, Aaron. I mean, I think in terms of Christian maturity is certainly a thing, right? I mean, if you're going to take up a new sport in like boxing, for example, if you decide the very first thing you're going to do is hop in the ring with Muhammad Ali, actually be difficult. He's dead, but you get the idea.
Quite an easy fight.
You're going to get the stuffing knocked out of you. But if you wanted to work your way up to that kind of level of the sport, you could do so. And I think it's not a problem thinking about the same is true spiritually. That start on the milk and move on to the stronger stuff. And of course, Paul obviously engaged with this stuff. The very fact that Paul could say avoid their teaching is toxic. Paul has obviously checked it out, and perhaps as pastors and leaders need to check it out so they can then inform the congregation to go, well, let me just tell you very quickly why I wouldn't read Rob Bell's latest splurge or Steve Chalk's thing. Actually, I believe that some of those writers are beginning to engage in heresy offsetting. It's like carbon offsetting. You buy one of those heretical books and they'll give $1 to Westminster Theological Seminary in the States. See, that was a good joke too. But that you're right about the other stuff. I mean, the modern kind of wokey stuff. I think a couple of things I suppose I would ask. I would say here. One is to ask yourself why you want to read a book. If you simply want to read it because you want to look kind of wokey and progressive, then you probably are setting yourself up for a fall, because that's an entirely wrong reason to read anything. I mean, literally anything. And you can get that outside of Christian circles. I have a few sort of slightly snobby friends who, whose bookshelves are quite impressive, but you ask them, they've never read Dostoevsky or Jane Austen or whoever. They just got these beautiful hardback editions they bought because they think that's what educated people have on the shelves. And I think the same can be with the wokey stuff. If you want to read somebody because you're, everyone's talking about this particular theologian in your circle and you think, gosh, I probably do need to engage here, that's different. And then, of course, the other thing to do is, and this becomes as you read more widely, is try and understand the underlying assumptions can be helpful. Some of the stuff that you talked around sort of critiquing your cultural perspective and whiteness and all of this kind of nonsense, and I've kind of given my game away by using that word nonsense. Underlying that is something we might do another show on, which is the whole kind of idea of critical race theory that has absolutely an intersectionality, which, with all the due respect, particularly to our secular friends, I have more due respect for secular friends on this. There is no substance to those things at all. So it just, it's good that it's got the word theory in there. It is actually a lot of just sort of words arranged into a sentence with enough sort of clout behind it. People take it seriously. And I think in the church, we can ask, what's the underlying assumption? And I get worried about underlying assumptions that want to divide us, that want to see people in the color of their skin rather than the content of their character, to quote Martin Luther King. And I think you can then measure it up to the standard of Christ. And it was actually very interesting. I was doing a seminar for Wycliffe College at University of Toronto last night, where I did a bit of teaching. And I was on there with a friend of mine called Bruxy Cavey, who's a pastor of a large church in Toronto. And I forget the question that came up, but Bruxy talked about the fact, he said, we need to be realistic as evangelicals, that if you just randomly read bits of the Bible, you could pretty much make the Bible say anything. If you want to justify genocide, just pick a few texts at random, out of context of the Old Testament, and you could do it, whatever you want to do. However, if you make Jesus the center of your theology and you connect everything to him and read everything through him, it becomes a darn sight harder to do that, because he won't let you get away with that. And he should be the lens through which we read everything else. And I think the same can be said of reading more generally, but particularly things that claim to be Christian. We can ask the question, okay, what would Jesus think of this? What happens if I bring this idea to the foot of the cross and read it through there? Does it bring me? Does it bring others to Christ? Does it help me reach people? Or does it just divide and sow doubt and destruction and whatever? In which case, I need to ask some questions. It's one thing if it's a secular book doing that. They have no excuse to know any better.
Yeah.
When it's people who purport to be Christian, sowing division and setting people against each other and making themselves the center of the story and not Jesus the center of the story, then I think we can at least ask some questions, and maybe there's a time to say, this isn't helpful.
That's really helpful, Andy. And so, yeah, as we've said before, I think if you focus on Jesus, we're gonna annoy people on the right and the left because he did, and so our own sensitivities either way are going to be challenged. He talks about hell more than anyone else in the Bible, and he loves sinners like no one else in the Bible. So an incredible kind of blend there. So really good advice there on the why question. Let's just move on to, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of hows. You both mentioned a little bit already about how you read. Are there sort of points of debate here about in the culture we live in, about how we read? Michael, give us some examples of how you tend to read.
Yeah, so I think to kind of give you a kind of evolution of my reading habits, I guess like most people in the world, I just generally used to read books because that was the only way to read books. And then I kind of went for a stage of reading on Kindle, although I kind of fell out of love with Kindle after about a year. It's interesting, actually, that seemed to match the statistics at the time that was saying that kind of Kindle was kind of taking off. And then suddenly people realized, actually, I kind of like having the physical book. Like it can go on my shelf, I can lend it to people, I can underline it when I'm discussing it with someone, I can find the page easier and all that kind of stuff. So actually I went back to kind of buying physical books, and then about a couple of years ago got recommended to listen to an audiobook just because it was a book by a comedian. They said it was really funny if you listen to the audiobook, so I downloaded Audible and listened to that and really enjoyed listening to it. And then I thought, hang on a minute, I could listen to other books this way. I love the outdoors, I love hiking, I love cycling and stuff, and so I found, well, actually I can cycle and hike and listen. I've been on a sabbatical about a year before where I've basically been in a kind of continual tension because I wanted to be out doing exercise, but also I felt I probably should be sitting reading a book. So for me, that was like a real revolutionary thing because I was like, actually, I can listen. Is it as good? I mean, I guess that's a big debate we could have, like probably you do take in more if you're sitting and reading the book, but my argument is I take in more listening to it than I would if I'm not reading it at all. And I can actually consume more by listening. So there are books that I still physically read. I've got physical copies. If I really enjoy the audiobook, I often then go and buy the physical book. So I can kind of annotate it and lend it to others. So I kind of have a mixture. But actually for me, it probably meant that I was reading at least double, if not triple, the amount of books by then starting to listen to books as well. So I found that really helpful. So a bit of a mixture, really.
That's good. And I think you said you read a Solzhenitsyn book recently that was 24 hours. Is that right, in length?
Yeah, so Good Like Archipelago. So like things like that, and Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, which is pretty long. I was thinking, like, actually, in terms of sitting and reading that, like, I get the other thing, I get really restless because I'm kind of an activist. So when I sit down, I get distracted because I want to kind of do something. So for me,
make some bread or make a pork pie, don't you?
Yeah. Exactly. So if I can be doing something and listening, it kind of helps if you're obviously on your own and you're not having to think about anything else at the time. So I did have a sabbatical after that, where I was in New Zealand, and I basically just filled up my phone with audiobooks and hiked. But because I wasn't having to think about anything else, I was on my own. It was a really good time to kind of process, and so I found that personally really beneficial.
Great, Andy. Anything to throw in on that? Do you agree? Disagree?
Well, this is great because I get a bit of controversy here. Okay, I confess funny thing is I'm a technophile, but I do have some questions about these other kind of forms. I mean, I would definitely say, look, audiobooks have their place. I mean, we drive up and down the country quite a bit, less because of lockdown than we're used to, but we still up and down the country a bit. And if we're doing 8 hours up and down the country, like we're going down to the southwest for Easter, that'll be an 8-hour kind of drive. And so we found audiobooks are great. And we've got some great audiobook series at the kids. We've got almost 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. We've got this great Christian biography series that they love. And that's fantastic. It makes the drive go by. And like Michael, I've sometimes when I'm hiking on my own, will stick one on. Kindle, there are certain things I read on the Kindle. You may laugh at this, but one of the places I love my Kindle, I read in the bath. One of my favorite things to do is get a mug of tea, and a foam bath, and the Kindle. It's great. It's waterproof, and it's not heavy, so the paper doesn't get wet. So I read something else. I've just read Pilgrim's Progress for the first time. Finally worked through it. It's not the easiest read in places, and I chowed my way through it. I read that in the bath, funnily enough. But I do think if I want to learn things and remember things, and not just learn them, like I'm a massive Lord of the Rings aficionado. I'd read that book, every couple of years. I wouldn't dream of reading that in an e-version. There's something about being able to slow down that a book helps you do. And here's the other thing that's interesting. There's been studies done showing that the printed page works better for memory. Like anyone who loves books probably had that phenomenon where they think, well, I've got a favorite book and I've got a favorite passage in that book, and I know it's on a right-hand page, somewhere towards the middle, down the bottom of the page, and you can find it by geography. And I think e-texts destroy that. And in fact, actually, the Shallows that we've mentioned a couple of times in this show and the previous one, Nick Carr in the book The Shallows quotes a piece of research from I forget which leading American university on e-texts, where they took a group of postgraduate students, postdocs. So these are guys and girls with PhDs, and bright people. Divided them into groups a group about sort of 6 different groups. Gave them each the same journal article. One had it printed out. The other 5 had an electronic version with ascending numbers of hyperlinks in the article, and they were told explicitly, don't click on the hyperlinks, just read the article. And they were given a quiz at the end, see how much they remembered. And basically the guys and the girls with the paper copy, massively better retention, and as the number of hyperlinks went up, the retention went down. And the psychologists who kind of processed that through thought it's something to do with distraction, that even your brain seeing a hyperlink, those little blue things underlined, is enough to get you going, oh, where would I go if I click? So we don't fully know all the reasons why, but it does seem that reading on paper is definitely better. But there is definitely a place for those other technologies. And look, if it's a case of I don't have the time to read, the only way I'm going to engage is through audiobook, then get an audiobook. Don't be put off. But I think if you have a time to make the choice, do at least make sure you've got a healthy amount of print in the mix. Not least, one final thing, by the way, there's something about the age of books too. I love old books, and C.S. Lewis talked about old books, letting the fresh breezes blow through. And one of the things I love about old books, I'm collecting, I mentioned them a couple of times on the show, Borum books, 55 of these things. And I love it when I get an old copy of Borum. They're about $20 for one of his. And sometimes you'll have a name in the front, and then occasionally I'll flick to the back, and I'll see that someone's taken notes, like what I was reading on the other day, and someone had written down sort of 20-page references with a thing that struck them. And there's something about being in touch with history. He was I think it was a Christian, I get a brother in this case. It was a male name inside the cover, who'd obviously read that book, goodness knows when, but potentially 90 years before, had been struck by some things. And it was quite a magical moment, actually, to read it and then look up what he'd, marked in the margin and gone, oh, yeah, that's interesting, or let's go on that one. So, and you can't do that in the same way electronically. I know Kindle has some clever functionality and stuff, but it's not the same.
Just one other thing on that. I know we're kind of fast approaching our longest podcast yet, but despite our greatest efforts to the contrary, but in terms of reading, very helpful in terms of like reading stuff. We talked about reading articles. There are kind of articles and shorter kind of pieces that you get sent online or linked to on Twitter and stuff like that. And you think, oh, I want to read that. One of the things that I found really helpful, and I know Andy will approve of this because he got me onto Remarkables. But my Remarkable is basically a kind of like it's a bit like a glorified Kindle in some ways. I use it for making notes, but also I can send PDFs to it and web pages to it. But the beautiful thing is I can't go online on it. There's no browser or anything else. So for me, anything I get sent, I think I want to read that, but I haven't got time now because I'm in that kind of process of going through emails. I stick it on my Kindle or my Remarkable rather, and then Andy's showing his off with his cool kind of sleeping cover thing. And then I can read it later when I've got time. And I find that I'm in a different place then. And because I can't click on any links, because I can't click to email, I can then digest those articles or those web pages in a way that I wouldn't have done if I was kind of sitting at my computer.
And he's now showing us, the various. See, after all his chat earlier about economic, disparity and things like that, he's using these very expensive, remarkable things, which are remarkable because they replicate paper and pens, which is wonderful. No, but it does look like they're quite interesting things. I think like I said earlier, my technophobia of the early iPhone, where people showed me a candle on screen rather than a real candle. I think I prefer pen and paper, and indeed physicality. But I think all of those things really helpful reflections there on how we can try to fight for reading and read in the right ways and read responsibly in this kind of culture that we live in. And Andy's now really. I just wish you could have the visual now. They're both of them. They've gone off on one. They're showing us their gadgets.
Probably a good point to bring it to an end, I guess.
One day, my children are going to find a remarkable device in a skip and pick it up and go, this was Andy Bannister's remarkable device, before he burned himself to death after his wood burning business didn't quite take off, or the venture with pork pies with Michael didn't quite take off.
It really caught fire.
That's it. Yeah. Excellent. Well, seeing as Michael has helpfully mentioned there, we have indeed surpassed the record, as we have every single episode, and no doubt always will surpass this record of exceeding the length of podcast. So our tight 20 to 30 minute podcast does seem to be creeping ever closer to a longer form. But I hope if you are still listening at this point that you have enjoyed this and found it helpful. Please do like, subscribe, share where you can. It'd be good to get the word out about this and for more people to be able to hear and join in the discussion. Send us some comments. Tell us what you think. Send us your fan mail. Send us any requests for bakery goods that you may wish from any particular member of the trio. But that's all for me, Aaron Edwards, Michael Ott and Andy Bannister. Farewell. See you next time.
See ya.
See you next time.